in the basement. He comes running up and he sort of jumps into the bedroom and he just throws open the door and he says, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And in between all my sobs, I just go, "I was afraid of the dolls." Which of course is not true, the fact that I had the wherewithal in that moment of grief to sort of crack a joke like that, I think really helped me process that grief of my father's passing. And I think that really is that lesson that my dad taught me, that, it'll be all right. Grief is fine. It's a natural process, but it'll be all right. This too shall pass, and sometimes you just have to make light of the situation, as dramatic as it can be. Because in the end, it'll be all right.
How do young men like us optimize our lives in a way that lets us achieve success and meaning? Come with me as I interview top performers and delve into key areas of life: habits, finance, psychology, health, relationships, work, creativity, and business. I boil the ocean of men's advice into usable wisdom in this podcast to give you the answers. My name is Blake Bottrell, and this is the Distilled Podcast. My guest today is living out his boyhood fantasy of exploring the world like Indiana Jones. In 30 years of traveling, he's learned enough life lessons for a dozen people, collecting passport stamps that could more accurately be described as stamps on his character. Today, I'm excited to explore these life lessons with him and find out why ultimately a person doesn't really need much more than a good place to sit and drink tea. Joel David Bond, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Blake. That's a great intro. You've read my work.
It's my job.
Indeed. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
What did you learn from having tea with Iraqi guards on the Iranian border?
Ooh, wow. Such a great experience that was. I think what I really learned, amongst a number of things in that incident was, one, just the nature of the modern nation state and protecting borders and what that kind of looks like in that particular space on the border with Iran and Iraq. And, I guess really the thing to really learn from this is the vignette, just to throw in there, is I was hiking with friends and we got invited to the guardhouse with these border guards, and they took us up to this top of the mountain there and sort of this spotlight that shines down the valley at night, and you can see across the border into Iran, way up in the mountains there. And I remember sitting in the bunkhouse with all these guards, and they'd taken all their guns off their shoulders and lined them up outside the building there. And we're sat sort of on the bottom bunks in the bunkhouse there. And the guy comes around, he's serving us tea or whatever. And the guard next to me pulls out his phone and starts swiping through these photos and showing me like his kind of day-to-day life of guarding the border. And in and amongst all these photos were these images of like people who died crossing the border in the middle of winter and frozen to death or whatever. And he's got these photos of these, dead bodies that they had found on their patrol along the border there. And I remember just sort of being, sort of shocked and scandalized first off by, wow, this guy's just showing me photos of dead bodies on his phone, but also, just the nature of migration, people who are seeking a better life somewhere else and the great lengths that they'll go to make that happen. And yet also the need to sort of protect your own borders and boundaries, so that the people who are resident in your country, who are natives of that country, can have access to the services that they need without being overwhelmed and flooded by people who are coming in to take advantage of that same system. So it was this sort of balance between, the nation state and like wanting to protect your own people, but also the needs and wanting to help those who are coming in. It's just such an interesting dynamic to sit there in that space. And I'm not, a citizen of Iraq or Iran. And here I am sort of on this space, seeing this happen and unfold in front of me. But I'm there as a, basically an immigrant myself, working in that country and that culture. And it just, man, yeah, it's a hard question to answer, but there was a lot to unpack in that one scenario.
What do you think that says about human adaptability in hard situations?
I think we're really way more resilient than even we think we are. Yeah, I think that's kind of the first thing that jumps out to me when you ask that question is If I'm really going to sit there and, drink tea with these border guards from Iraq on the, border with Iran, and they're showing me those photos, and, one, I am a lot more, I'm a lot stronger for the experience. I've learned a lot more about just the day-to-day life of these border guards. And then also just to see what people go through, the extents that they go through to make a new life for themselves, and the risks that they put themselves through in order to put themselves in what they hope would be a better situation. Sometimes the risk to the point of death. But that the human spirit really is this kind of persevering force, that we all have this drive within us to really persevere, to overcome, to seek growth and new challenges. I think it's built into our DNA. We are designed to grow and to change. And I think this particular experience really helped me see that in a different way. That force of the human spirit that drives us to do things we never thought we could.
I like that you opened with the word resilience. I'm about halfway through a new book from Abigail Shrier. It's called Bad Therapy.
Ooh.
And the underlying notion of that book that we've sort of been teaching people backwards is that actually resilience is the norm and trauma is not the norm. And that if we are to let people go through living their normal life experiences and dealing with the grief in their own time, oftentimes the end result is the resilience of the human spirit instead of the trauma that we've been told to believe is associated with hard things.
I like that. Resilience is the natural order of things, in a sense. Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. What was the name of that book and that author?
It's called Bad Therapy by Abigail Shrier.
Nice. Yeah, I'll have to look into that one. I think that would definitely resonate with a lot of my own experience.
So, what are the facts, feelings, findings, and futures of the chapters of your life living in Iraq?
Yeah, so those 4 F's that you pulled out there, those actually came from a soft skills training that I did in the UK, 2 decades ago. And that's kind of stuck with me as kind of a framework to use for understanding experience and unpacking your life's events. I think the facts of my time in Iraq are learning a lot about conflict in the Middle East, a history of striving for independence within the Kurdish region in the north, the political instability that's there, but also, again, that resilience of human spirit to just overcome any challenges that are thrown at you. My feelings about the whole thing are incredibly strong. I unexpectedly fell in love with the culture and the country and the people, did not expect to stay for 7 years of my life, and was devastated when I was forced to leave. Absolutely, and that's still so fresh. It still is hard trauma to, recover from. I'm learning resilience even in the aftermath of that. And I found, my findings, I suppose, are really about the nature of resilience and what it takes to frame things in a way that help you grow and learn and, unpack your life's experiences with a lens that helps you grow with integrity to move forward. Yeah, I think I have just found, new types of resilience in that. And the future looking forward, I think, is now that I'm sort of extracted from that environment, what do I do with the knowledge that I've learned? What do I do with this experience? How do I apply it? How do I share it with other people? And what does the next step look like now that I'm no longer able to live in that space that I've grown to love? How can I adapt or change some of those lessons, some of those experiences to apply to a new situation, a new job, a new career, a new location? So, yeah, facts, feelings, findings, futures.
Are there any special logistics that go into living so close to conflict zones that people might not expect?
I mean, there's the standard of registering with your embassies, having just a contingency plan for emergencies. I remember in 2017 when the Kurdish referendum took place for independence, that referendum, independence referendum. I remember there was a lot of political tension in the air. And while it didn't necessarily feel unsafe in terms of personal safety, things felt very unstable politically. And so, as part of my contingency plan, I had a bag packed, ready to evacuate the country. And it sat in the middle, in the corner of my room. And I informed my taxi driver of choice that should the shit hit the fan, I was going to call him and have him drive me to the border with Turkey, where I could hopefully bribe my way across with the Turkish border guards and exit. Because the borders were closed, the airports were closed, and my visa was just for the Kurdish region. I couldn't go to federal Iraq. I'm right near the border with Iran, which is off limits for US and UK citizens. And, so there was really I had no exit at that point. And so, contingency plans, I think what you learn living in a conflict zone is that you can have all the contingency plans you want, but, they're worth shit until it actually happens. Then you've got to adapt. And so I think that's where I've really learned that adaptability and that resilience is you can sit there and think of all the plans that you want, but they're never going to pan out how you think they will. It'll always be something different. And then you just have to work on the fly and be like, okay, I guess we're just going to have to do this thing and take it as it comes in the moment. So I think that's what I really learned, again, in that resilience factor of living in a conflict zone and living in Kurdistan for so long. It's just kind of being present in the moment and taking things as they come, of not trying to always plan out the future, because who knows what tomorrow's going to bring. You're only guaranteed this moment anyway.
I think it's really sort of insightful and opens up a question as to, you have this contingency plan that if things go wrong, you can leave the country, you can go back to the UK, you can come back to the US, you can try to bribe your way across the Turkish border. But for everyone that you lived there with for the 7 years, that's their home. They don't have anywhere else to go.
Yeah.
So that's just everyday life for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's this sort of, white man's privilege, I think, that came with that. This sort of, American passport index privilege, I suppose, that was a little bit hard to reconcile. Knowing that a lot of the people that I lived and worked with and who I called my closest friends had no options, that there wasn't a choice. And that for me, I had innumerable choices in many ways. I had lots of contingency plans, and if plan A didn't work, plan B might. And if that one didn't work, I could work my way down the alphabet until one of them did, And for a lot of people locally, there just wasn't that option. I think that really opened up to me this concept of, what we think of as freedom. I think in the West, we sort of have this concept of freedom as being able to do whatever the hell you want. And I think in places that are developing, where there aren't as many resources, that's kind of a goal to aspire to. It's like, oh, we want to have more choice. Freedom would be the freedom to have the choice. And I think in both instances, that's really not the right definition of freedom. That freedom is actually, in many ways, it's the ability to have the choice, but to say no to the ones that you think you might want in favor of the ones that you need, or that might be beneficial to your community and those around you. And I think, it's this evolution of freedom. And I think even in the West, we're not as far along in that evolutionary scale as we should be. That freedom isn't just being able to do whatever the hell you want. And I know a lot of developing countries, they want to they aspire to that. And I think in places where we can do whatever the hell we want, we really need to aspire to be able to take those choices and select the best ones from that and say no to the others. I think true freedom is being able to say no. And that, I think, is what was really hard, is because a lot of my friends, they didn't have the opportunity to even say yes.
Certainly going to write a newsletter about passport privilege. That is going to be the topic of a newsletter. I love that. I'd never thought about that before, but I love that as a concept. Yeah. What did you learn from your sabbatical of faith?
Ooh, Unpack that question for me. What do you mean?
It feels as though in my reading of your ongoing writings that there is a strong underlying current of faith. And you mention in one of the writings in particular this idea of a sabbatical of faith or a questioning of faith, as some people might call it. What led there and what was the outcome on the other side of it? As in my readings, it feels as though you've returned to those more faith-based roots.
Yeah. So, I would call it a deconstruction and a reconstruction of sorts. I grew up in a very conservative evangelical Christian home. So those are the values that were instilled in me growing up and that I really adhere to well into my college years. But I think what really led to a lot of that deconstruction, that sabbatical of faith were a number of things. One was just beginning to see the rest of the world, that there were multiple viewpoints and multiple expressions of faith around the world. And my one perspective from North American Midwest upbringing wasn't the only valid expression of how to be human, that there were other ways that people were living their lives, and were happy and filled with joy and productive and successful, and that didn't require the same narrative that I grew up with. And I think the other part of that, a big factor of that, was my own sexuality and realizing that my spirituality growing up and my sexuality never seemed to mesh. I didn't know how to reconcile those two. And it's like I'd always tried to get these two cogs to spin in sync with each other. And I think what's sort of happened through that sabbatical of faith and then a subsequent kind of return/reconstruction is I've learned that those two cogs don't have to spin in sync with each other, that those are two cogs of a much larger machine that makes up my life, and that they don't have to go tooth and tooth, gear in gear, that this cog over here powers one part and this cog over here powers another part, and that they're both important parts of who I am, but they aren't necessarily, and they both contribute to the overall well-being and function of me, but they don't necessarily have to go, tooth and tooth and spin in sync with each other. And so I think what that's done for me is just help me, deconstruct my own faith, my own personality in a sense, and find ways to reconstruct it so that I still have a sense of spirituality, a sense of faith, a sense of something bigger and greater than just me, but also can identify the parts of me that are part of who I am, part of my makeup of Joel Bond. Yeah. So, for me, I've always found that faith is an important motivating story, but that it doesn't necessarily have to be, the capital T truth that I grew up with, that it can be a lowercase truth that still is motivating.
I love that. I wrote a newsletter probably 6-ish months ago now that I titled The Logical Utility of Church and Religion. For someone of faith might look at that and view the title as heresy, but I think in trying to deconstruct those stories that you're talking about, at least in the Western world, we've done a lot of tossing the baby with the bathwater, and that there's room for some of the wisdom that exists within these religions to inform the way we go about living our lives without, like you say, having to be the capital T truth.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. I've spent a lot of time in, obviously in Islamic culture. My immediate family has strong connections with the Jewish communities around in our neighborhood here. And I think, just being in these multi-faith different environments, growing up, I would have sort of been pressurized to sort of proselytize, oh, you need to be saved, like that would have been the narrative in my head. And I think now, my approach is, push into your story, push into your narrative, be more Muslim, be more Jewish, be more Hindu, be more whatever, dig into it and find what's the universal value there. What's that universal truth that can find a modern expression for you? For, my Muslim friends who observe Ramadan, great. Do it, fast, and tell me what you learn from that. What is that teaching you as a human being? Do I want to fast? No, I don't. Not for 30 days. That's not within my narrative and my framework, and that story doesn't mean so much to me. But, the story of Lent, the seasonal journey in the, Christian calendar there has a meaning for me. And so I might choose to fast from a particular thing as part of a narrative that I'm familiar with. And I think it's just learning to see it's that universal value that underlies those concepts, such as fasting and faith and family and love and acceptance and togetherness and unity, etc. And finding ways to press into your own faith story and apply it to a modern context. So like you said, I don't want to throw the baby out with bathwater. I think the bathwater just needs to be changed because the baby shat in it. So
You mentioned a couple there, but is there any universal value that you come back to in your life, either as a piece of your faith or otherwise, that is a strong narrative within your own life?
no, I don't think there's a particular one that I come back to. It's a concept that, it rolls around in my head, and I wish I could sort of, the my German ancestry basically wants to like have a list of like, these are the universal values that every human being can apply, and live by. And it's much more nebulous than that. I don't think there's a clear cut, here's the framework of universal values that no matter your religious background or faith or upbringing, you can, figure out how they work. So I don't know that there's a singular one that really is core for me at this point in time. Apart from, I think, my most recent lessons on resilience. I think that's the value where I'm at right now. And I think that value will change and develop and grow and morph into something else over time as I have new experiences. And I think as I grow and mature, I just begin to understand that all these values are much more nuanced.
Why is Thanksgiving such an important time of year?
Because that is a universal value that I think we need to practice. One of the things that I love about Thanksgiving is that it's despite being a very American holiday, I think it has a lot of universal application. Who doesn't think that we should be thankful for things in our lives? And that regardless of your faith background or heritage, pretty much everybody can celebrate Thanksgiving. And yes, there's a narrative, there's pilgrims and the, settlement of the New World or whatever. But the value that underlies all of that is being grateful for the blessings that you have in your life that you may or may not be responsible for. That we all have parts of our lives that we don't have control over, and to be thankful for, for what has been brought into our lives. And so, I first started writing these life chapters every Thanksgiving as kind of a pushback against the whole Christmas season. Because, in Western culture and the UK and the US both, there's this sort of push for, Christmas cards and Christmas letters and the annual update or whatever. And I just felt it felt kind of shallow to me in a sense to just be like, oh yeah, here's the mandatory update every Christmas. And I wanted to sort of shift that perspective back a little bit towards gratitude and thankfulness. And these are, this goes out to the people in my life that I am grateful for, is what that started as. As this sort of developed over time, that gratitude towards a specific group of people who've been in my life has now been generalized to a much more larger audience. But I still hope it maintains that spirit of gratitude, of thankfulness for what has occurred in my life over the past year and the lessons that I've learned. So, yeah, I think it's just an important season to stop and be thankful.
I think anybody that knows me understands how important gratitude practice as a part of my life is.
Mm.
So it resonates with me that taking the time around Thanksgiving, for as much as other people don't spend the rest of their year being thankful for the things that they do have. And all of this, I think, started for me during my travels as well. When I went to Southeast Asia, primarily Thailand in 2017. And for the happiness of the people there, a lot of it didn't come from having the worldly possessions that people in the West have.
Mm-hmm.
And understanding that you can be happy and thankful and gracious for what you do have, and smile. A smile is the same in every language,
Yeah.
that all of that comes from a different place. So I try to remind myself daily. I have a prompt when I'm in bed. I have a Notion template,
Mm-hmm.
bringing things back to the here and now. I have a Notion template that I fill out every night that asks me, what's my story for the day?
Mm-hmm.
What's one thing that went well? And 5 things that I'm grateful for.
Yeah.
And it really just helps to bring back the now and remind myself that even if almost everything I had went away tomorrow, I'd still be okay with exactly what I have now. And I don't need any more. And everything that I do from here on out really is gravy. Going back to you just need a place to sit and have tea.
Yeah. In my book, one of the things that I write about is I think I use the phrase, everything I needed, I already had. The resources inside myself, that power, that inner strength, externally, yes, I had all the clothing that I needed, I need whatever, but that the real power of the human spirit lies within you, and tapping into gratitude, using those thankfulness reminders, I think is just one way to really exercise the human spirit in that way. So yeah, I love that. Just having a time to be thankful at the end of every day. I have just in this past season, I've developed a different practice. I found actually in the department store here, it's a toy for children, and I saw it. I was like, I need this for me as an adult. And it's just this wooden cutout of a tree with these sort of notches and these empty branches, and it comes with a page full of paper leaves that you can tear out and write a gratitude on and attach to the tree. And so you watch your tree of gratitude bloom over a season as you add, these daily affirmations to it or whatever. And that's been a really fun process for me, I think, an organic one, really in more ways than one, as I've processed my own, trauma from having to exit Iraq. I think that's been a really good process to reflect on the things that I am grateful for, that I do have so much, even in the face of tragic loss.
How's the actual act of writing changed you as a person?
Writing really forces me to reflect. It really forces me to go inward and to process my life's experiences. I think it's all too easy to just kind of live your life and let it run you by. And writing for me, whether it's just journaling or sitting down and being thankful, or making a little note to add to my gratitude tree, or actually writing a life chapter or a new book, all of that is processing my life's experiences. And I've said to people in regards to my recent book here that I lived this traumatic experience, and then I had to relive the experience by sitting down to write it. And then I had to live it a third time by sending it off to an editorial team who told me my experience wasn't good enough. You need to change this and write this better, and or tweak this chapter or whatever. And I think writing as a process itself is processing. It helps you make sense of your life in ways that just living it day to day doesn't do for you. Yeah, I think it's helped me be way more reflective, and to be able to understand my life's experiences on the fly, even because I know that later on I'm going to write about this, or I know that I can reflect on this later. And so it helps me engage almost in a different level with my daily experiences, because I know it'll be processed somehow through my writing.
We've talked about this a little bit, but is there a single thread that binds the spine of the book of your life chapters that you write every year?
I don't know that there is at this point. I have looked back at a lot. I write them sort of as standalone chapters every year, and I think, the thread is me, and I think my goal is to sort of create a rich tapestry of my life's experiences as I go along. I've had people suggest that I should compile them all into a larger book. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that there's a singular thread that ties them all together, other than they're my life story. It's the life story that I'm currently writing, and I don't know where it's going to end up. I just know that I got to keep writing it.
I love this idea of sort of stumbling around in the dark. Do you remember what Coddiwomple means?
Oh yes, it's something along the lines of setting out, with intention, but with no destination in mind, or something to that effect. It's being very purposeful with having no aim, basically.
Yeah, I love that. I had a conversation last week with a gentleman named Mark Agile, and we came to this or we didn't come to the conclusion, but through the course of the conversation, we're talking about this idea of you should at least head in one direction. And if you don't know your exact purpose in heading that direction, you can start crossing things off the list of what you know you don't want to do.
Mm.
Or if your life's purpose can't be defined at the age of 16, that you should at least pick a direction and start walking, because as long as you're remotely in the right direction, you'll eventually be able to course correct. The analogy is a plane, and if you're off by 1 degree every I forget what the full analogy is, but the point is that there's a purposeful going in one direction
Mm-hmm.
and finding things out from there. So I think it's a understated story that people don't pay more attention to the direction and the story that they're living.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a danger in paralysis by overchoice. I think that ties back into earlier, just the idea of freedom as being able to say no to some things, being able to make those decisions, being able to decide yes, this, and no to that. This paint color, not that paint color. This shirt, but not that shirt. This career, not that one. I mean, I think, whatever the decisions that you have in life, I think that's part of the sense of freedom, is being able to make those decisions and say no to the rest. And that as you make those decisions, yeah, it helps you figure out the trajectory of where you're going. And do you need to course correct later on? Yeah, you probably all do. But, that's part of life.
There's a particular sundial in Jaipur, India, that completes a full circle in your life.
Yeah.
What's the lesson that came from that story?
Oh man. That was a lesson of ingratitude, thankfulness for a mentor in my childhood that influenced me and sort of inspired me to explore and to travel. Yeah, that really was a lesson in gratitude, I think. Just the overwhelming sense that there are other people that have fed into my life in ways that maybe I didn't realize at the time, but have now come to fruition many decades later. And so that particular story in my life really was kind of to pay homage to, this, to Randy Nadler, who inspired me in so many ways. Yeah. And to just be thankful for the people who have fed into your life along the way. I think that's really, that's the lesson from that. And that there are people who I maybe even currently now don't realize are feeding into my life, but in, 10, 15, 20 years time, I may look back and be like, oh man, like I can't believe, how influential Blake was in my life.
Who knows? The one podcast starts a cataclysmic butterfly effect that comes to fruition, like you said, 30 years later. So who knows?
Who knows? Who knows?
Is there something that you have come to understand about mentors in the traditional or non-traditional sense, and how people not necessarily go about finding them, or maybe do go about finding them, but that is helpful for how people should look at others in their life in respect to being a mentor? What I'm trying to get at the heart of this question is that I think people overlook people that could be mentors in service of finding somebody that's at the top of a hierarchy, or is the most popular person on television, or is a successful business person, when a lot of the mentors in most people's lives could be an uncle that they really love, or a parent, or the guy down the street who's really good with his kids. Like, is there something in your life that you've come to understand as it relates to mentors in that way?
it's a multi-layered question, I feel. And I think for me, really mentors, one of the key things to mentorship is just vulnerability. That's the word that comes to my mind right now, is being vulnerable enough to share parts of your life with these people that you wouldn't share with everybody else necessarily. And I think what I've learned through the kind of mentors that I've had is that it is often a two-way street. We sort of want to think of a mentor as being somebody who sort of, one pours into the other, but I think it can be mutually beneficial that, I found myself mentoring some people who really have done so much in return for me as well. And it's been this mutual openness, this mutual shared accountability, vulnerability, if you will. And I think the most effective mentors are those who are just open. They're just open with their lives and are seeking deep, genuine connection. I think anybody who's seeking that has the potential to be a mentor.
I'll ask the opposite side of the question. I know you work with a lot of kids,
Mm-hmm.
worked at an international school, all this. Is there a moment that stands out to you in your life of being that mentor for somebody else? Is there a story? Is there a vignette in particular that you revisit or think about as this was really impactful on my life where they poured into you?
There's a name that comes to mind straight away just when I think about mentoring in recent years, and it's one of my colleagues actually, who wasn't a colleague to begin with. For privacy's sake, I'll name him Dan. He was a local guy, so his name wasn't really Dan. He was a local guy in Iraq, and we'd been hiking a number of times through a hiking group, and he really just admired me, admired my wisdom and my sort of approach to the world. And I remember going out on a number of occasions with him, and he just kind of wanted to sit and glean from everything I had to say. He just listened, just wanted me to spout, anything that I could share. And he just was like a sponge for my viewpoint, my worldview. And I remember sort of thinking like, man, this guy really, idolizes me in a way that felt almost uncomfortable, but at the same time kind of, was a little bit of an ego enhancement, I suppose. And it was, a couple years later where I was able to help him secure a job at the school and then subsequently train him in that job, which again kind of reinforced that sort of like I'm the mentor and he is the mentee kind of role. And then it came down to sitting in a conversation one day in the break room, and I was talking about my book and how I was trying to figure out how to get it published and do I want to self-publish. I couldn't find anybody, a typical traditional agent. And, I'm now back in Iraq after having taken a year out in the States to write the thing. And I didn't have the access to the resources or whatever. And he turned around and he said, well, my dad works in the publishing industry and he's got contacts, and my mother was a librarian, and, he had all these sort of connections or whatever. And, then I was able to sort of open up and be vulnerable with him and be like, listen, this is what the book's about. I'm not quite sure it's the right audience. I'm not sure I feel comfortable publishing it here, but at the same time, like, you've got a know-how into this. And I think that openness and that vulnerability really cemented that relationship. And I was able to then sort of take from his life experience and learn. He helped me get published in Iraq. Without him, I wouldn't have happened. And so it was that mutual exchange, that, being open, he opened up so much of his life to me. I opened up so much of my life to him, and it was just, I think that to me, that kind of is a picture of what a good mentoring, healthy relationship should be, is that openness, that vulnerability, that mutual give and take. And it may not happen, simultaneously. It might be, one person first and the other person next. And it might, chop and change and flip flop around. But I think that really is the essence of a really good mentoring relationship, is that mutually beneficial exchange and that vulnerability.
How much did your dad's love of bridging divides model what a man was supposed to be for you?
Oh man, you're asking a hard question. This month is 14 years since he passed, and I just Easter Sunday went to visit his grave. I wrote in that piece, I think, that he didn't leave behind any grand inheritance financially, and worldly wealth or whatever, but that the inheritance that I received was his strength of character and his ability to connect, his empathy, really. And I think, For me, my dad really, for as many of the things that I struggled with in that relationship, he really taught me what it meant to have an open heart to everybody, what it meant to be so secure in your own self that you could strike up a conversation with anybody and everybody and be inquisitive and curious and want to connect. And I think that is a strength of character that, that's it's hard to come by these days. And I think he really left a legacy in that. I'm so grateful that was what he modeled for me, because that, in combination with Randy Nadler as a mentor when I was a kid and exploring the world, I think has lent itself to building my character, being the kind of person who's not afraid to jump into, post-conflict societies or move to another country or drop myself into a different culture and to just be open and willing to explore. It's given me an almost abnormal level of trust in other human beings. I'm very quick to trust, and that will probably get me in trouble sometime. But I think my dad's example and my curiosity, my willingness to engage with people, like you said, a smile is universal in every language. And I think those sorts of things are the things that really taught me that it's okay to take a risk, to go someplace new and to try and connect. Because I think deep down, as human beings, we need connection. We don't just want it, we need it. And deep down, I think, even though we put up walls and we sort of create these barriers around ourselves, that deep down we really want those barriers to fall. We really want to make a connection. And that unless there's some, neurological impairment of some variety, that ultimately we're, designed to connect and to engage and to be empathic with one another. And, my dad really modeled that in a way that I'm so grateful for even to this day.
I love that you put a big emphasis on trust there. I wonder if I can read you an excerpt from the newsletter I wrote literally last week. There was a lesson and then a sub lesson here. It was a short first lesson, so I included this secondary lesson in there. But the first lesson was the importance of not having 0 days, and that's besides the point, but that's where the sort of newsletter starts here. And it says, the first time I remember hearing about this concept was 6 or 7 years ago on my trip to Asia. I can picture exactly where I was. I was about halfway through my trip on my first visa run from Thailand to the Malaysian border. A common practice for many backpackers in Thailand, a rite of passage. Keep in mind that all of this was necessary due to entry and exit requirements of typical Thai visas. Because this was normal, both hostel staff and other backpackers ran me through the plan. Get a bus to Hat Yai, take a smaller transfer to Georgetown, Malaysia across the border. Meet up with a guy who runs a pharmacy that has a connection with the Thai embassy in Georgetown. Leave your passport and $100 with him. Come back in 3 days to collect the passport with the pre-approved visa. Get back on a transfer back to Hat Yai. Listen to the driver when he tells you to put 500 baht, $20, in your passport on the visa page to smooth things out. Arrive back in Thailand and take the bus back to the hostel. If that sounds a little sketchy, A, you're right, and B, money can buy you pretty much anything. The amount required is just lower outside of the Western world. The part that makes this a little less sketchy is that I have 2 passports, so if everything really went to shit, I could get home on my American passport. The bonus lesson here is that defaulting to trusting people makes life a lot easier. There is a 100% chance this will blow up in your face at some point, but in aggregate, you'll likely come out ahead.
I love that last part. In aggregate, you're likely going to come out ahead. And I think to me, that's a foundational lesson there, is trust first. Someone has to trust someone else and take that initial step in order to make that connection, in order to be vulnerable, in order to be a mentor, in order to have that empathy with other people. Unless somebody takes that initial step of trust, we're all going to live in our own isolated worlds and be wary of one another. And I don't think that's the way to live, And I love that, ultimately, it might blow up in your face. It probably will at some point. But taken as a whole across the span of your life, man, trust gets you so far. It really does. It pays off.
Your dad told you that it'll be all right. And I have a similar tattoo on my chest that's written in my dad's handwriting that says, if you can read this, everything will be okay.
Oh,
How do you bring yourself back to that in hard moments?
oh, it'll be all right. You know, an alternative phrasing for that is "this too shall pass," is a common sort of meditation mantra, and that came up actually on my time stuck on Samos, Greece during the pandemic as part of the meditation cycle that I went through at that time, and I think I do come back to that in the sense of when hard times hit, this too shall pass. It'll be all right. This is the only moment I'm guaranteed, and so sit in this moment, press through it, and see what happens next. And if you are willing to, the word trust just comes back to mind again. If you're willing to trust the process, it'll pay off in the end until the one time it doesn't. And then it's fine still. It's, it'll be all right. I feel a need to share a story at this point, which is only tangentially related to this, but it is, related to my dad's passing. I was living in the UK at the time when my dad passed, and I flew back here to the States for the funeral. And the rest of my family, we all converged here on the house. And, I have 3 brothers. And so, we're a family full of men. Even the dog was male, my mother wasn't allowed to be a female growing up. Like she just was, she was just mom, right? And so when we all sort of, left and my parents empty nested, my mother all of a sudden found this, femininity that she had never been able to express before. And so the guest bedroom, got decked out with all of these antique dolls and these traditional costumes with these, ceramic faces and beady eyes. She had, lace curtains and, frilly doilies everywhere. All of a sudden, that was her, sort of feminine space was the guest bedroom. And the bed that was in that room is the bed that I grew up sleeping in. And so when we all came back and converged on the house for my dad's funeral, we were all drawing straws for who's going to sleep in the creepy doll room, right? It's creepy in there. No one has to sleep in the doll room, And so I sort of, caved, and I was like, listen, I grew up sleeping in that bed. It's comfortable. I'm super jet lagged. I've come from across the Atlantic. Like, I'll just sleep I'll take the hit. Like, I'll sleep in the doll room. And my mom's like, oh, do you want me to turn the dolls to face the wall so they're not staring at you while you sleep or whatever? I'm like, no, that's even creepier. Like, just leave them. It's fine. So everyone's kind of, having this joke about, oh, Joel's going to sleep in the doll room. Well, 4 a.m. the following morning, I wake up, I'm done sleeping. Jet lag is now taking its toll. And it's like, all right, let's get up and go. But it's, the pre-dawn gray of that room. And I'm, sat there and realizing I'm about to go to my dad's funeral that day. And so, I have this grief-stricken moment and I start to cry. And so I get up out of bed and I pad down the hallway to my mother's bedroom and I, curl up in bed beside my mom and I just cry, just grief-stricken, dad's gone, the funeral's happening today, what's going to happen next? And I get to the point where I'm sort of double pumping it in tears, just like, and I'm wailing, I'm snot-faced, it's just, just crying uncontrollably. And I'm so loud that my oldest brother hears me from downstairs in the basement. He comes running up and he sort of jumps into the bedroom and he just throws open the door and he says, what's wrong? What's wrong? And in between all my sobs, I just go, I was afraid of the dolls. Which of course is not true, the fact that I had the wherewithal in that moment of grief to sort of crack a joke like that, I think really helped me process that grief of my father's passing. And I think that really is that lesson that my dad taught me that, it'll be all right. Grief is fine. It's a natural process, but it'll be all right. This too shall pass, and sometimes you just have to make light of the situation, as dramatic as it can be, because in the end, it'll be all right.
I love one line that I heard from you that I'd never heard before. And you just said, grief is love with nowhere to go.
Yeah.
And when I heard that, I was like, okay, this absolutely makes sense as a processing of this emotion. I think, thankfully or unthankfully, like, okay, this is going to sound really weird as a following sentence, but my dad passed away when I was 14, 2008. And I think I'm particularly low in neuroticism, which is the tendency to feel negative emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So I've told varying versions of this story, but I don't remember crying at my dad's funeral.
Hmm.
And for the good or the bad or whatever that was, I included in a newsletter that I wrote, actually just particularly to my mom. It was literally called Dear Mom. And I remember my dad's last words to me being, "You're the man of the house now."
Well,
So that, I don't know if I like short circuited the normal grief pathway by understanding that it was now my responsibility
hmm.
for however much responsibility a 14-year-old can assume.
Yeah.
But I love the reframe of grief just being love with nowhere to go. I think that's really impactful and could be a helpful understanding for people, particularly going through moments of grief,
Hmm.
if they've never explored that as a lens with which to look at it through.
Yeah. For me, that's been super helpful is to see grief as love with nowhere to go, and to to process grief takes time. I don't know that you ever finish processing grief. It sort of comes in different forms, but I think part of that processing is finding new outlets for that love that you had, to find new ways to channel that and apply it. I've heard it said that love is expansive. It's designed to fill whatever space or capacity that is that it finds itself in. And I think when you find yourself without a vessel for that love, it does kind of wander. And I think finding a healthy new vessel to put that love in is part of that process, part of that grieving process. And I think a lot of people, they find themselves putting that love in the wrong vessel and the grief process, and so maybe they fall into addictive patterns or behaviors, or turning to the wrong sources of comfort. But I think if you can recognize that your love needs to have an outlet, and that you can put it into productive, healthy vessels to channel that love, you're well on the way to growing as a human being and finding new expressions and new ways to be in the world.
Think that's absolutely as fantastic a place to end as I can imagine. And I have one final question that I like to ask all my guests. And that's, what's the last thing that you changed your mind about?
Oh, last thing that I changed my mind about. The last thing that I changed about my mind about is where I was going to do this podcast. Originally, I was in the other room and I could hear my stepdad upstairs on a Zoom call, and I said, "This is going to be too noisy. I'm going to change my mind and do it in this room instead." And so I unplugged my computer and pulled everything in here at whatever 3:59, and at 4 o'clock logged on. So here I was. That's the last thing I changed my mind about.
There you go, Joel. I love it. Your stuff is great. If we want to send people to find all your stuff, where should they go?
JoelDavidBond.com has got all of my work, and I'm on social media on Facebook and Instagram at Joel David Bond, basically everywhere on the internet at Joel David Bond. So
Perfect. I appreciate you spending an hour with me, and it's been a super insightful talk, and I can't wait for more insights to come in the future.
thanks so much. It's been great, Blake. I look forward to showing up again.